The competitive 40K network presents Art of War. Art of War. Strategy and tactics. Discussions with the best players on the planet. Now your host, Nick Nanavati.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Art of War podcast. I'm your host, Nick Nanavati, and this week we've got a returning guest, perhaps our most violent guest, Anthony Vanella. Anthony, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, Nick?
I'm great. I'm super excited. I love all things chaos. And Anthony, you and I, we may not always agree on what the right way to approach chaos is, but you know what? Results speak for themselves, and you are putting up the W's, and you're doing it with the faction that absolutely no one is talking about, no one has been playing, no one has regarded as good. 40K is a shooting edition. What is going on here? You're putting up W's with World Eaters. Yes,
so they definitely got the exact right amount of buffs in the last data slate, which was cool. They weren't really lacking for very powerful army rules or even necessarily good units. All their data sheets are pretty good. They were just too expensive. So when they came down in cost, combined with some other nerfs happening in the game, it kind of opened a hole for them, in the meta, to be a lot better. Combined with people being broadly uncomfortable with interacting in the fight phase in 10th, because why would you if you don't have to? There's been a lot of time to shine for the, what is actually the fastest army in the game, which most people don't know about World Leaders.
I'm so excited for you to break it down for us. For everybody that doesn't know about what's going on, this is a two-part show. Part one, we're going to get to know about Anthony, how he discovered the power that is World Eaters, what that power is, what that looks like, what's the list he brought to LGT, and what's the basic principles about how you kill, maim, and burn. Beyond that, we're going to go to part two. Part two is for our subscribers. That is going to be available on AOW40K.com. That is our Patreon. That's where you've supported me for years and years and years, and thank you so much for doing so, because it allows us to keep producing this kind of content. So if you want to keep more episodes coming out, check out that Patreon and subscribe to part two, because Anthony's going to be breaking down all of the where he puts the models, what his tricks are for the fight phase that is so hard to navigate in 10th edition, and ultimately how does he go 5-0 in the land of elves and broken chaos space marines and all kinds of stuff without even taking a shooting phase. So if you're interested in that, check out AOW40K.com. Anthony, talk to me about World Eaters, right? How do you even spot this diamond in the rough amidst all the Wraith Knights and Obliterators of the world?
So I was playing Chaos Space Marines for WTC this year. I played for Team USA, and I was, assigned kind of the Chaos wheelhouse, because outside of, Jack looking at T-Suns, we didn't have a lot of Chaos expertise on the team. And they were kind of a natural fit to what I had been doing in 9th edition, with me having an awesome run on Emperor's Children, and then the back end of the edition on World Leaders. Up until I played Manny in round 6 of LGT, I actually hadn't lost a tournament game on World Leaders ever, which was my proudest accolade of them until I got drowned in cultists.
What a way to go.
Yeah, it's, that's literally the first time the World Leaders lose in the lore, is that they get drowned in bodies. So,
so you're basically a prophet of Khorne.
Dude, I am the prophet. I am the one who lights the way for others. So the big thing with them is that in WTC testing, because I had played a couple games with them when the edition first dropped, is that they were super fast, and it was pretty reliable to get them to be super fast and, go and do things. But in a world of getting overwatched by a Wraith Knight and GSC just broadly being what they were before, they weren't really bringing anything unique or new to a team. In addition to that, they were too expensive. It didn't exactly have enough assets to get over the line. An army like World Leaders is often balanced around the fact that it is planning to finish the game basically tabled. You, as an only melee army, your only response to opposing threats is to put your units out there and accept that they are likely to have some form of response to them. Or turn over turn, you need to have enough assets to keep up with that rate of attrition. When the army's too expensive, it just doesn't work. But kind of like I was saying before, that balance update was able to restore, basically function to the faction.
I think a lot of players saw that balance data slate and they were like, all right, 10 points here on 8 bound, 5 points there on whatever. It didn't seem like that impactful, especially like when you're building a list across the whole thing. Like, how many points did you actually get back out of this?
About 300. So
that's not nothing.
Yeah, no, it definitely is
Elder
not.
going up 4, World Leaders coming down 3 is like 700 point delta.
Yeah, it's huge. So one of the big things was Exalted 8-bound used to be 60 points a model. They were 180 for a unit of 3, which is just too much. But now they're down to a much more reasonable 50 points per model, right? And in
That's
a list
not
that's
significant at all.
right, in a list that's taking 9, that adds up pretty quick. The regular 8-bound went down a fair amount as well. Berserkers went down 15 points per squad. Like, these are units that you're taking, kind of in volume. So them going down any amount, it really adds up in a hurry over the course of a list.
Makes a lot of sense. So I see how getting points reductions kind of keeps your attrition rate up. But like when I play against World Leaders, I'm always like, how do you have all this stuff running at me? And then I take a shooting phase and I'm like, oh, there's a lot less of it now.
Yeah, there's significantly less.
Yeah, right. So I totally get the logic line of you balance around being tabled. And it kind of goes back to your mindset of as an aggressive player, which I know we talked about last time you were on.
Yeah.
World Leaders strike me as a super aggressive faction. Is that pretty much how you play them? Just running up and charging people?
So I generally play them pretty aggressive, but World Leaders are actually the most relaxed of the armies that I play in a strange way. So if they go first, World Leaders have a great propensity to like get in there, jam, force awkward responses and like push people, kind of like into a locker. But that doesn't always play out going second. And when you go second as them, again, you don't have the guns to force like a full committal go turn in the way that CSM does, right? Like you play CSM, you know how it goes. You pull the Forge Fiends out of reserves, you get the angles, you drop the Obliterators in, you shoot with those, like everything else pushes up at once. Like you can make the board, you can plunge the board into like a, no pun intended, state of chaos pretty quickly. World Leaders don't really have that benefit in the same way because you're stuck, charging screens or charging past screens and like double fighting, piling in, doing what you can to cover that delta. So all you're doing early as World Leaders is actually just trying to push a primary differential, which was an effective playstyle in 9th, but is actually much more effective in 10th because the scoring has changed, right? You can score 50 points of primary and you can only score 40 points of secondaries now. So even if your own secondaries don't go great, which is like a whole separate thing that World Leaders are one of the better secondary scoring armies in the game, even if your secondary plan doesn't work great, your opponent is often in these games having to overcome a like 20, 30 point differential on primary.
Right, because there's World Leaders on objectives, and ultimately, like, you die when you sticky them. We'll get into your tips and tricks all into part 2, but, like, you have such good objective control, and no one wants to go towards World Leaders standing on objectives to go take them.
They certainly do not.
And, like, while you're cowering in your little hidey hole, trying not to get charged off the planet shooting your guns, what points are you scoring? That's a whole different question.
Yeah, exactly. So it's easy. I think people tend to lose the forest for the trees when they're playing World Leaders a little bit. And they, like, you can get through, like, turn 3 feeling good that you're, like, knocking the World Leaders dead. But you look at the scoreboard and you've got 2 zeros on primary and haven't scored a secondary point yet. And it's like, well, yes, there are less World Leaders now. But unfortunately, 40K is ultimately a game won and lost on the scoreboard.
So to me, and I'm a very defensive, reactive player, right? So like World Leaders totally opposite to my playstyle, or so it seems. And like I'm thinking this is like a control style army, actually, right? Where like sure I could just go run charge across the table. In a lot of games, that is the game plan, and that's a victory. But like you can totally set your army up behind walls and be threatening to charge the crap out of them, and they either walk straight into World Leaders charges or they sit back and don't score. Is that like a line of play you take often?
That is the most consistent line of play with World Leaders. So the trick is that you're often parked behind walls, set up such that someone can get an angle to shoot one asset if they'd like, but then they are 12 inches or so away from your lines. And that is just not a great place to be with the with the general speed of the Eater's army. We're talking about an army, Nick, that on like 1 unit per turn goes 17 and then charges. That's not total threat distance. That's movement, and then it charges.
I need you to break this down for me a little bit more slowly. Right? These guys walk, and they're like infantry on foot. I mean, they're faster than regular Space Marines. But what is this 17 inches we're talking about?
So let's go through. Well, actually, all infantry in the army that either starts in a Rhino or is an 8-bound has this threat range. So they're the exact same. So to break it down, a unit of Khorne Berserkers that start in a Rhino, they will disembark from their Rhino 3 inches, essentially gaining 3 inches of movement, right? From there, they will move 6, so up to a total of 9. From there, there are Blood Tithe buffs or Blood Yahtzee buffs, depending on who you talk to. Two of the ones that you can get are Advance and Charge, as well as +2 to your movement, and these are army-wide buffs. So the +2 takes you to 11 inches. An advance roll goes as high as 6, taking you to 17. Now, normally, you'd be at the mercy of the dice here, but World Leaders in their detachment also have a stratagem to automatically advance 6 without rolling a dice.
That seems pretty fast. Move 17, then roll 2 dice.
Yeah, move 17, then roll 2 dice to charge. Them moving 17 was actually a key portion of why I took them to LGT, because on many of the table setups at LGT, or for the UKTC in general, there is moving exactly 16 or 17 gets you from the safety of your giant L all the way into the opposing ruin, protecting their easy to get objective. So no objective on the board is safe except for the opposing home objective at any point.
That is a fascinating thing you just there. One, an amazing threat range, of course. But yeah. Two, you said specifically that 17 threat range is why you took them to LGT, which leads me straight into the next line of questions, which is all centered around your actual performance at LGT. What we're talking about here today. What was that preparation like that you even figured out that 17-inch charge ranges are a relevant thing? People don't really think like that. How did you come up with that?
So I was going over which armies that I was going to take to LGT, and I was a little bit back and forth between Eaters and just playing the CSM build that I had a ton of reps on because of WTC. And then going into the event, I found out that just the way travel stuff often works out, I wouldn't be able to play the Monday of the event regardless. So, even if I had gone entirely undefeated, beat Manny, won in the Shadow Round, I couldn't play on Monday either way because I had to schedule a flight for that day. So, given that, I was going to essentially have 6 games against, prime competition, and World Leaders, past, a couple of test games that I had played earlier in the edition, were pretty untouched by myself. I figured now was as good a time as any. And in the process of, going over, some of the terrain with a friend of mine who's plays the UKTC a ton, and Brian Sipe, and talking to Innes Wilson a little bit about it, I had kind of worked out oh, wait a second, if I just put a Rhino against the edge of this ruin, I can go all the way from here into the opposing, safe space without them being able to respond because the angles into my ruin are impossible to get. And similarly, my, safe expansion objective, I can jump from there all the way into their home ruin without being touched as well. So it was indirect shooting, except I shoot units at you instead of guns.
Yeah, I always think about combat as the most pure form of indirect, right?
Yes, exactly.
You're really just another dirty indirect player.
That's right. Yes, I just once I do it, that unit is gone forever usually. But that's actually another part about World Leaders that people don't often realize is that one of the other buffs that you can get from the Tithe is a Feel No Pain, and if you already have a Feel No Pain, it makes it one step better. So the Exalted 8-bound, when they have the 5-up Feel No Pain running, demand a very real response from your opponent, which if you're clever with positioning, you can then respond to with additional melee threats. So that's kind of the play cycle of the army.
So basically, that you send a missile out, they react to the missile, you can then keep that chain of reactions going. And theoretically, while you're doing this, you're standing on objectives and they're just playing defense. And ideally, you're contesting their objectives too, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the combined primary of the games that I won that were by a significant margin. My round 3 was very touch and go because I played an excellent player on Grey Knights. But even in that game, he was only really able to score primary because it was priority targets. Which is when you score a whole bunch at the end, which my army being tabled at the end doesn't interact super well with that mission. But again, across the games, it was a lot of we finished the game, my opponent scored, 5 total on primary or 10 total on primary.
Yeah. So it sounds like you have a very primary domination army. What is your plan for secondaries, and how do people who maybe have their own plan for secondaries that's kind of built in, how do you handle that?
So one of the big things is that this is a common thread across pretty much all Chaos armies or armies that have access to a good transport. In the UKTC, there's a ruin that is directly in the center of the table and mirrored on both sides, so it's symmetrical. This ruin cannot hold the center objective, but a significant portion of it is within 6 inches of the center, and that means that you can pretty safely assume you're getting homers every turn if you can get a unit into that position and not get it murdered, right? Chaos in particular is great at this because they have rhinos or they have nurglings in CSM, but specifically for World Eaters, the ability to deploy a rhino 14 inches back from that position where it's very unlikely to get shot because there's basically a corridor that is safe. You then move the Rhino up. It starts doing homers. Yes, you're not touching the middle objective, but certainly neither is your opponent. And from that position, you can missile out the unit that is inside the Rhino at least, once or twice to dunk on primary or go achieve something else or kill an important unit or so on and so forth. For example, in my list, I was often setting up the Master of Executions there so that when people would, as an example, like when I played against Thousand Suns, I send my big Exalted unit, they answer it with Magnus, the Master of Executions solos Magnus. And that kind of play cycle is what you're looking for.
Wow. So it's almost like every game has its own tempo that you have to figure out as a release player. Which unit trades for what, where, when. Yeah,
that's a huge part of it. The other side of the coin is that broad strokes, like the tactical missions generally are, like a common complaint, at least for me, for the tactical missions is that sometimes you can get scammed, right? Like if your army's not particularly quick, it is very possible that you draw some tactical cards that are just not happening this turn.
Felt that pain this weekend.
Yeah, 100%. Like as CSM, I think have some of the hardest time with it because a lot of your units that are good are move 4 units or move 5 units or whatever, move 6 units. World Leaders, a lot of the tactical deck is be in your opponent's deployment zone or control an objective in the middle or do some form of action in the middle. And all of those are super easy when you're planning to do them anyway. There was definitely games where people would elect to ignore Angron, which is an entirely viable way of playing or trying to play around the army. But in those games, I had tactical and he's just stood on their home objective, scoring 8 for capture enemy outpost and 4 on deploy teleport homer and 5 on primary every turn. He's just stood there being a point factory. So that's a unique upside of tactical for this army that doesn't necessarily always play that way for other armies.
Definitely. It's tactical definitely rewards you for controlling the board and having fast things to react to be able to do stuff. And that is exactly what World Leaders do. And on the flip side, it's super hard to play with tactical against World Leaders because of the same reasons, right?
Yeah, you're not
in the World Leaders outpost. When's that happening?
Yeah. Believe it or not, you can get back there because I'm not usually going to turn around to go get you. Grey Knights can get away with it, but any army that has to do it naturally by going through me is very difficult. One of the other benefits, you asked a little bit about denying the opposing secondaries before, right? So a huge benefit that World Leaders have that actually all Chaos factions have is that we have I don't think everybody makes it sticky, but at least CSM and World Leaders. Our cultist unit is a big 10-man unit, and that big 10-man cloud is an excellent deep strike screen because once they have a rule that lets you make it so your home objective cannot be taken away from you unless someone physically places something there, and then they're a giant 10-man unit screen. That combination usually keeps your backfield safe for at least 2-3 turns, and that by that point it's usually enough on the primary denial that you're really far ahead.
So talk to me about, I get all the things, in terms of we're dominating the table, we're dominating primary, points are falling into place, all that checks out. But now I'm talking about how do we actually kill our opponent? Obviously, we're super hard hitting in close combat. We have amazing stats once we get there. Getting there is not hard. But your opponents have screens, you have no guns. Your opponents have transports, you can't crack that. You have to open up every single avenue to connect with your opponent the hard way. So if they just have here's my cultist, you have to spend a whole turn dealing with that before you get to the obliterators and the forge fiend and all that stuff. That process has to be very painful. What is your method for dealing with it?
So that process can be painful, but it depends a lot on the opponent's positioning to be perfect. So one of the major changes of the 10th edition fight phase is that you are able to now pile into and fight things you did not charge. So very often what will happen is you will see opponents, especially opponents that have been playing the game for quite a while and have the muscle memory of doing so, will set up their units a tightly packed brick of Terminators, a couple, an inch or two away from their thin line of cultists that keep their Terminators safe from previous editions, right? You can attest to it, you played in the old days. People would run into the cultists, kill the cultists, and then you would destroy them with the Terminators, right?
This is the way.
Right. Now, if you do that in 10th, what happens is I charge into the cultists with a unit of Exalted 8-bound, a big, giant, burly unit, as well as a little 5-man of Khorne Berserkers. And that 5-man of Khorne Berserkers erase those cultists from existence. The Exalted 8-bound then pile in and hit the Terminators, who they were not in contact with a minute ago, and blast them out of existence. This kind of plays
rules nuance, right? You can activate the unit Even as long as it made a
As
successful
long
charge.
as it
right?
charged.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it can fight whatever.
And it can fight whatever it can reach. And additionally, doing things this way removes the ability for the opponent to use the counteroffensive stratagem, the 2CP interrupt, because they're not currently in engagement with anything. So they can't interrupt and hit you. So you essentially get free, full control of the fight phase because they screamed.
Around always strikes first, too.
Yeah, it gets around all sorts of stuff. I used it to get around the Death Leaper with Khorne's unit. Otherwise, Death Leaper could have like precisioned out Khorne. It could have been awkward. Nope. Khorne just, his unit tagged a whole bunch of like Tyranid screening elements, and Khorne just happily piled in and beat the Death Leaper to death.
So I've developed an anti-World Eaters defense tactic that I actually employed this past weekend when I played against World Eaters. And
Yep.
it was very similar in style to what you're describing, but I specifically left my cultist line 4 inches in front of everything behind it because I
Yep.
did not want you to pile in through me. Would that trump this tactic of yours, or do you have some other work?
That definitely works when opponents do that. This is where we kind of lean on those point drops a little bit, right, Nick? So we have a lot of assets because of some rulings that Games Workshop has made and stuff like that. Every unit in World Leaders has a bunch of attacks, but we're often not attaching Lord Invocatus or the Juggernaut Lord to units. And that means we have additional pieces that have like crazy high attack volume, as well as the grenades keyword and some other stuff, that their entire purpose can go to be to trade down for a screen, but just to remove that screen so that next turn I can get there with something real. The other ace in the hole with this is Angron, who flies.
Flying is always super helpful. The man moves. How far does he move in charge?
So Angron, if you take all of the movement buffs, goes 22 inches and then charges.
People think they can ignore this man as a game strategy. I mean, he does come back to life. I suppose.
Yeah, I was gonna say the important part of that is that he recycles. Like if he didn't recycle, then yes, it would be you would just murder him the second you saw him every game all the time. But someone smarter than me has done the math. If you kill Angron on turn 2, it's between a 65 and 70% chance, with all the manipulation of the rolling that World Leaders have, that he comes back by turn 4.
Wow, that is awesome. So walk me through those mechanics. How does Angron come back to life? And is it part of your strategy when you use him?
So I started playing World Leaders without Angron in 9th edition. I didn't use him at all. I thought the resources that he asked of the army were much too much in exchange for what he gave. That has since changed quite a bit. So the way you resurrect Angron now is the World Leaders, faction mechanic is that they'll roll 8 dice at the start of the battle round. And use combinations of doubles and triples of those dice for army-wide buffs. In addition to that, if they roll 3 6s on those 8 dice, they get to resurrect Angron. It does remove those 3 dice from the pool, but insofar as I can tell, based on all the literature that is available and all the FAQs and asking other judges, it does not count as purchasing a blessing. So you're limited to purchasing 2 blessings. But the 3 dice are removed from the pool, which would make it kind of difficult to purchase additional blessings. But the short version is basically that you roll 3 6s on 8 dice. Angron is back in business. It's worth noting that this happens immediately. He goes into reserve. So if your opponent went first, you still roll this dice at the start of the battle round, meaning he could rapid ingress in their turn, which is very dangerous.
Oh my God. So let me get this straight. If I kill Angron in my turn, you can revive him and then ingress him, or how does that work?
So let's say your turn. Let's say you went first, right? Your turn goes pretty well, but not 100% to code, and you get Angron down to 1 wound left. A shame, but it happens. Then in my turn, I go to move him, and you overwatch me and end Angron's day before he gets to connect. Very sad, but it happens. At the start of the battle round, meaning shortly before your turn, I will roll the blood roll. If I get 3 6s on that roll, or on the reroll, and icons can mess with this too, we'll go over that in a second, he immediately goes into reserves, and I can rapid ingress him.
Yeah, and then there's a second Angron on turn 2 showing up at a deep strike, and I basically have blown my alpha strike already, I'm sure.
Yep, and likely, again, at that point, you blew your alpha strike to try to kill him, didn't, you got him in Overwatch, but then my army got to respond to that alpha strike, and now there is another Angron.
Yeah. Awesome. So Angron, obviously, big, scary, and close combat. I've been hit by the man. You don't survive being hit by the man. He moves 22 inches and flies and comes back to life. How does someone handle this? How do you do anything against that?
So there's one of 2 ways of handling him. It depends a lot on what army you're playing. The one option, if your opponent didn't take tactical, is to just be like, he kills one thing a turn, he has an aura that's good, but I'm just gonna like let him do his thing. This works for certain armies that have very stable game plans that can afford to do something like that. However, not all armies exist in that realm, and if your world user opponent, again, took tactical, I would not advise this. The alternative is to make your opponent hit the 3/6s and just end his life when you see him, and just accept that you're going to have to do that. A big part of why you take Angron is that he forces difficult choices, though.
I mean, I'm sure that's a part of how you play your whole army, right? Is forcing difficult choices. That's being an aggressive player, as you put it.
Yep. Yeah, maximum discomfort for my opponent from a gameplay perspective. I try and be nice while I make you uncomfortable.
It's very conflicting.
I do my best.
Good. So I think we beat around the bush just a little while now. So why don't you walk us through what is the list you actually took to LGT?
Okay, so to LGT, I played, first one, the Warlord, Angron. I played Lord Invocatus, who is a Juggernaut Lord who gives Scout to other units, which is a huge part of the World Eater's Alpha Strike that we'll go over at some point, I'm sure. I took a standard Juggernaut Lord with the Favorite of Khorne enhancement, which lets you re-roll a Blood Yahtzee roll. I took Khorne the Betrayer, and I took a Master of Executions with the Berserker Glaive, which is an enhancement that gives him +1 attack and damage, and on the charge gives him plus D3 attacks and damage. That guy is like probably the best character in the list. We'll go over him in depth at some point, I am sure. So that's all the characters. I took a unit of Jackals, a unit of 10 Khorne Berserkers, a unit of 5 Khorne Berserkers, 2 Rhinos, 6 Exalted 8-bound, 3 Exalted 8-bound, 3 regular 8-bound. That's the list.
When I look at lists like this, I always feel like there's so much design that is behind the lens of the creator here that no one sees. Like, to me, as a looker of the list, it is just like World Eaters units, in whatever ratios and sizes and shapes you wanted, but World Eaters units. But I'm sure there's so much math and calculation and thought behind why each unit is there. What's your, I guess, quick pitch for all of them, if you could?
Okay, sure. So do you want me to, I'll start in like characters and work my way down, and I'll just pair the characters with their units, and I think that makes the most sense. So Angron, we kind of went over already. He moves really fast. He, in addition to all the other stuff that he does, he gives you a really good like anti-big stuff answer. Because on his big profile, he's strength 9 attacks on the charge at strength 16, -4 d6 +2 damage. And then past that point, he also has a 6-inch aura of either +1 to charge or reroll all hits that are both extremely good for just like upping the consistency of the World Eater's army in ways that may otherwise be, kind of unreliable. So that's Angron. Past that, we have Lord Invocatus, who enables the dreaded World Eater's Alpha Strike, the nightmare scenario where the World Eater's player goes first, and then an Exalted 8-bound unit moves 23 inches before you're able to react to it, between its 6-inch scout move and then its 17-inch normal move, and then charges. It's very scary to enable that across many units. So Invocatus does that, and he himself scouts. So essentially the World Eater's army will have 4 total scouting units in this setup, where Invocatus does it, the 6-man of 8-bound does it, the 3-man of Exalted 8-bound does it, as does the 3-man of Standard 8-bound. So it's a lot of scout moving assets kind of all coming at you at once. From there, the Lord on Juggernaut, he's just a really good like backfield sweeper, and he's the most durable character that can carry the enhancement that is like mandatory for the army. From there, we have the Master of Executions, might be like the hardest hitting single character in a game. If you spend the CP on him for +1 to wound against, character vehicle monster units, he can like just one round lights out an avatar by himself, depending on the D3 roll that he gets on the way in. Be that Avatar of Cain or Yin-Karn.
That's because his Berserker Glaive gives him an extra D3 damage when he attacks with it?
Yeah, so the Berserker Glaive gives him an extra D3 damage, and because it is a modifier and how modifiers are calculated in 10th, the halving of the damage characteristic occurs before the adding of the D3.
Oh, wow. So basically, the Avatar takes your damage 2 characteristic, halves it to 1, then you add D3. And if
Correct.
I'm not correct on this, you roll 1 D3 and that applies to every single attack? You don't roll like an extra...
Yep, because the D3 is rolled in the charge phase, because you roll it when he connects.
Oh, okay. So this guy could just be anywhere between damage 3 and damage 5.
Yep.
What a number.
In addition to that, he has precision, dev wounds, and has full reroll to hit and wound against character models or character units. So he is very dangerous to an avatar.
You're making my CS so jealous right now.
He's very good. He also gives his unit fight first.
And he chills with 10 berserkers, I'm sure.
He usually hangs out with 5 in this list because of the next entry. So the next unit is Khorne the Betrayer. Khorne hits very hard. He is 9 attacks on the charge at 7-2-3, strength 7, AP 2, damage 3. He always fights on death, so while world leaders have access to that as a tied buff, Khorne himself always does it. And he gives his unit reroll 1s to hit and wound, which means that him, stapled to 10 Khorne Berserkers, is a easy 20 man of Necron solution that requires no external buffing whatsoever. They can just be on the other side of the table, jump out of the Rhino, go 17, and exterminate some stuff by themselves.
Wow, it sounds like you've thought of like every possible opponent when you're designing your list here. Is that a big factor for you when you're designing lists, like what you're going to play against?
Yeah, because I try and keep an eye on like what profiles I have in the army, and I want to make sure that I have enough, like gas, so to speak, for every existing profile that I will care a lot about. The 6-1-1 profile of that many Khorne Berserkers is also really brutal for Tau suits because they usually have a character attached, which means that you can trigger +1 to wound, and then you can have sustained hits. So all of a sudden, these Tau suits are getting hit just by the Berserkers chain axes 40 times at 6-1-1 on 3s rolling 1s and then 2s rolling 1s.
I mean, you don't have to tell me that the world leaders hit hard. I'm sure you got that part covered. I'm
Yes.
so interested in how you actually apply all these units, which is going to be the crux of our conversation in part 2. Like, where do you put these models? What baits do you set out? How do you break the screens and set the tempo? Because all that, it all makes sense on paper, makes sense over this audio podcast, but
Yeah.
it doesn't translate until you know exactly where to put the models yourself. So hopefully we can cover that in part 2.
Yes,
So let's
sir.
finish this list up here.
So that's Khorne and the Berserkers. That is, Mo and the 5-man. That's most of the units. Oh, the Jackals are super important. So obviously they make an objective sticky. They're also very unlikely to die to a random indirect gun because they have a 6-up Feel No Pain base. When you pick the Feel No Pain army wide, they go to a 5-up. So now you have cultists that are on 5-up cover saves with a 5-up Feel No Pain, and they can be rather annoying for a lot of the indirect pieces to remove outright. Additionally, if they hold an objective in the command phase, they make it sticky. You hold it until someone comes and takes it away from you, and that combination of things is really, really nice.
Making objective sticky sounds like so good for the world leaders. You have
it's the best.
there to take it away. No, thank you.
Yeah, it's so wonderful. It also means that if someone wants to plan to take your home field away from you, as long as you screen it out from being 3-inch deep struck on, your opponent usually has to set up some weird 3-turn plan to take your home field away from you, and that is really good for you because any amount of time that lets you cook their primary assets is great.
Right.
And then the list kind of rounds off on the 8-bound. Exalted 8-bound hit extremely hard, as we know. But their assets are twofold basically. The Exalted 8-bound have a 6-up Feel No Pain base again, which goes to a 5-up when you take the army wide. They have a aura of if you'd like to fall back, you have to roll a leadership test and succeed first. Otherwise, you are stuck in melee, and that just ends a game sometimes. Nick.
No, I really can see that. I mean, that sounds horrible. Fail the wrong one of those against world leaders, and you're just done.
Yeah, you're just stuck in with a 6-man and Angron, and it's not good.
As an outsider looking at world leaders, it feels like you have all of these potential just game-ending situations which are not reliable at all. Like go first to scout up and charge somebody. Angron comes back to life early. Trapped in combat, oops, or even just YOLO 12-inch charge, something like that. If you attempt all of these different things, any given one is unreliable, something will go your way though. And is that kind of the overall approach to it?
Yeah, it's so a big part of the idea is that you're not going to bet the game on any given 50% thing, but you will try 9 to 10 of those over the game. And if 2 pass, the game is likely over because world leaders plan themselves as, pretty high consistency, right? The thing I'm looking to shove people off is pretty deterministic in primary. But the introducing of the uncertainty to their game plan is a key part of what you're doing as world leaders.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. If a lot of players, I think the antithesis would be a control style army, just systematically screens and shoots and screens and shoots. But the more wrenches you can throw into that, the more trouble they'll have, or especially like as you put it, try 10 things to stick. That's a big deal.
Right, exactly. And I think a lot of if I had to compare it to other armies, like a lot of armies, especially in singles, right, are racing to 100. It's a common tactic, right? Like I'm going to get my 100, even if all I have to do is stop you from scoring 2 more points, and that's it, I win, right?
Yep.
World Eaters aren't racing their score up. That'll kind of happen innately just by virtue of like the primary and the taking tactical or the taking like a super easy fixed. They're actually just racing their opponent's score down. And that is the entire game.
That's very much your style, and I'm super excited to talk about it. Anthony, would you change anything about this list in hindsight, or is this like how you like your world?
So it lands at a clean 1975, Nick, which drives me a little insane.
I could not do that. I would rip something apart to make my list worse than that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't found an answer that I like really like to that problem yet. Jack, I went back and forth with Jack on this a bunch, and he played like a very similar version of my list, just like tuned a little differently because he didn't like Khorne or like the smaller Berserker squad as much, and he didn't
like 1975 either. No one.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. He also didn't feel the second Rhino was super necessary on GW terrain, whereas I like really, really love transports and rhinos. I don't know if that's some part of like when I used to play Drukhari will just always live with me.
Transports are great. I'm with you.
Yeah, they're so powerful in this edition. Like emergency disembark being free is crazy. But I haven't run into a thing yet where I was like, oh, I should change something yet. Berserkers, like on paper, seem like they're just not going to be very good. And then you realize that every time they activate, pretty much they have +1 to wound. And then suddenly that unit is awesome. And Blood Surge is also like for people that are here because they don't know World Eaters, Blood Surge is a rule that Khorne Berserkers have that you need to be paying very close attention to. It is when you shoot at a Berserker unit, if you kill any of them, they get to make something called a Blood Surge move of D6. When they do that, they have to go directly to the closest enemy unit, but they can end an engagement range. So unless you are wholly outside of 7 inches with all the units in your army from these Berserkers, when you go to shoot them, if you shoot at them and they hit a 6, they are now in engagement range.
I'm sure that can end games too.
That also can end games because, again, one of those units has a fights first character attached to it.
Oh my god, yeah. Just, oops, I shot you into close combat with my unit that hasn't shot yet, and you get to kill it in my turn.
Yeah. Well, and like the problem with the fights first unit, right, is that like every unit, like even if you do that to Khorne's unit, I would hit the unit that I ran into first. But now with the fights first unit, you've actually created a problem for yourself that is not really got a solution because normally what you would do to resolve that problem is like, okay, I messed up. I can just charge them with something else and kind of resolve this, right? Because they have fights first, you can't even charge your way out of this problem. Like that unit's just going to hit you first no matter what you do.
Oh my god, that's so dirty. And like it's the master of executions with the Berserker Glaive and 10 Berserkers, like have for 5, but have fun with that.
Either way is not great, right?
Right. No one wants to get hit by that.
Yes.
Awesome, Anthony. Well, is there anything I haven't asked you? I mean, obviously, we're going to save a lot of the matchup discussion, placement, and all that stuff's going to be in part 2 for our subscribers on AOW40k.com. But what am I missing here?
I think like the big thing is just that like as much as World Eaters are billed as a like put your head down, like no thoughts, just rush army, there are definitely the army that I am like having to use my brain the most when I'm playing of my armies because they just don't have a shooting phase at all. So like if something goes wrong in your charge phase or you like set up your plan incorrectly, it has the most like volatility that is out of your hands as a pilot. And it's just like a thing to keep in mind when you're playing against World Eaters is that your opponent has a lot of like checks where a game can go wrong for them as well. Like did they go first or second? Did Angron just say, I'm not coming back this game, I don't care what the odds are? Did they just fail that 4-inch charge with a reroll? Unlucky. Sometimes that happens, So there's a lot of like volatility on the game in both sides. You're trying to mitigate that as the World Eater pilot by having a super consistent game plan between, like tactical and primary denial. But it's not entirely out of your hands or in your hands.
Yeah, like, I didn't even cover the fact that your entire army's damage is random, whether or not it gets to be applied. Like 6s are safe, 5s are safe for charges, but
yeah, past that it gets real sketchy.
Yeah, right. Even those, I've failed 6s to lose games. Like, life
oh yeah, 100%.
How do you actually contemplate mitigating that? Like, is it just, don't go for the charge if you have points in front of you type of thing? Like,
It depends on how important it is, right? So I kind of have a bit of a checklist that I go through at the start of any given turn where like step one is like, can I inflict like game ending back-breaking damage right now? That's step one. Because if I can do that, then like the scoring can take a back seat for a second while I set that up. Step two is like, can I give my opponent either a literal 0 on primary? Not like a 5. A lot of the missions have like some degree of primary recovery, and like I'm kind of trying to give you a 5 anyway. I'm not going to sacrifice other things for it. But if I can give them a 0, some other stuff can take a backseat for a second. And then the last step is just like, where are my guaranteed points this turn, right? Things that like fall into step 1, I'll take an 8 or a 7. Things that fall into step 2 are like the 7 or 6 inch charge. And then step 3 is like, I'm taking 5s here. You know what I mean? So it just depends on like the level of risk to the level of reward. There are certain times where like Angron resed at like the timing such that he will come down in my turn. I'm not waiting a full turn to rapid him. I'm deep striking him, using the +1 to charge aura in my charge phase, because that's when you use his auras, and then just trying to hit an 8. And like, if he hits it, money. If he doesn't, he's in a position that is uncomfortable for my opponent to handle, while again stopping my 15s.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. So a lot of it's going to be contextual, like you said, and I think that's a great place to kind of end up our first part of the conversation. Anthony, thanks so much for coming on Chatting World Leaders. I know this is a super popular episode that people have been loving for.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, subscribers, we'll see you on AOW40k.com. For those of you who are patrons, for those of you who are not, I highly implore you to give us a shot. You get access to part 2 of this episode, along with 200 plus other episodes, and our amazing Discord server where you can literally bother Anthony any time of the day and somehow he replies.
That is true.
No, this man's a monster, literally. He's a prophet of Khorne to show you the light of the truth. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening.
Like what you just listened to? Check out Art of War Down Under and Art of War Unbroken on the competitive 40K network. The Art of War 40K.com.